What's up, everyone? This is the Nuts and Bolts Podcast, and I'm your host, TheOneJame, here with our amazing co-host, Airball.
Hey, guys.
And MichaelCrits.
What it do?
And we're here to give you the nuts and bolts of the standard and pioneer formats each and every week. But first, let me talk to you about the sponsor of the podcast, CoolStuffInc.com. Using code James5, you can save 5% off of anything in the store, sealed product, singles, anything you could ever need in Magic the Gathering, and a lot of other card games for that matter. They have it. Go save yourself some hard-earned money and go to CoolStuffInc.com today. Let's start off and go to the upkeep. It's our jargon of the day. It's Cantrip, a spell that has, quote-unquote, draw a card, tacked on as an additional effect, such as Consider, Opt, and even a creature, Spirited Companion, that draws a card when it comes into play. Basically anything that has draw a card tacked onto it, stapled on. If it draws a card, it can scry, it can do whatever, but as long as it draws a card, it's probably a cantrip. And you can use a cantrip as a noun that says, this is a cantrip, or you can say it as a verb, like, my Spirited Companion cantripped. You can use that either way. But anyways, let's go to our main phase. We're going to get through this a little bit quickly because we have a lot of cards to talk about, a lot of decks to talk about, what's working and what's not in the new format with the Brothers War just coming out for Pioneer, a little bit of Modern and Standard. We're going to talk about some cards, we're going to talk about some decks, and things that are shaping up the meta as we see fit. Right now, let's start out with the cards. Number one, Haywire Might. This is a card I don't even think we went over in a couple episodes before. Haywire Might. It's a 1 mana artifact, and you can get it out of your sideboard with Karn Great Creator and get it out and pay a green to kill an artifact or enchantment. And this card is currently in Pioneer in the Karn board, along with another card that I'll kind of like loop into this, and we can talk about this. The Stone Brain. It's the 2 mana artifact that you also get from Karn Great Creator, and I believe we talked about this a little bit extensively and how good this was gonna be, and it turns out that it's in every single Karn sideboard now, obviously in Pioneer Mono Green ramp. So, what do you guys think about both of these inclusions? I heard somebody talk about not playing Haywire Might because the deck, quote unquote, doesn't need it, but it's a really, really good card, and even making its way into modern Karn sideboards.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, if we're talking about Haywire Might first, no, I think it's a easy auto include to most Karn wish boards, whatever format you're playing. I don't really understand someone saying like this doesn't need to be included or is an auto include. Like it's just so cheap on rate. You bring it out, it can just beat your opponent for 1 if there's nothing on the board for some reason, or after you like clear the board with like Ugin or something weird and you slap it down. It's preventative. That's the one thing I wanted to speak into. It's like sometimes it could just be like super annoying because then your opponent has to like sequence things awkwardly. If they had artifacts and enchantments in hand, they're like, I really don't want it to be mighted. So like it can be sometimes like a card denial in itself, even when it's placed on the board. I mean, that's the next level thing, and that's all I really want to speak into. But I think it's a great card.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of like whether or not people think that it was going to be an auto include, yeah, probably. But like also in terms of whether people thought it wasn't needed, it doesn't really add a whole lot of extra utility that green didn't already have access to. It's just a little better, I think, than the artifact and enchantment removal that green already had access, artifact and enchantment removal that green already had access to. So yeah, you definitely play it because it's better than anything you had before. But how much does it move the needle? I don't actually know yet. I haven't had a chance to play around with it.
I mean, the thing that does kind of what this does is like what Meteor Golem that was in the sideboard before, but you even have the new card, Cityscape Leveler, that is also making its way into Mono Green Devotion sideboards in Pioneer as a just way better version of Meteor Golem. It's 1 more mana, but what's 1 more mana when you're playing Mono Green Devotion? And it makes like 40 mana a turn with Nykthos and everything. And it's an 8/8 trample as opposed to a 3/3 without trample. And it also works when it attacks also. So it gives Mono Green a different access to win off of when it might be just treading water, doing not too much when it can't find their copies of Karn or other copies of Karn or other copies of Kiora or whatever to keep the resources flowing. But the Stone Brain, I think, has, in Mono Green Devotion, for sure, in Pioneer, has even changed the way the deck wins the game, right? They can loop Stone Brain a number of times in a row, where you don't even need to do the cauldron thing anymore, I've seen.
I think Stone Brain is going to trick a lot of like newer, like beginner to intermediate players in some senses, because it's like this stone brain will solve all my problems. And if you don't know how to be proactive while also playing the stone brain, I think it can get you. But I think the stone brain's super powerful. Like if you're able to leverage it to like, you know, to its medium level or even above medium level, it's going to work out like so well for you. But I think if you're not respecting what your opponent's doing and also not being proactive, I think it could be some sort of like a gotcha card. You're like, this isn't working how I want it to, and losing games. So I think it's something to, pay attention to as you play it for sure.
Yeah, all right, let's go
Yeah.
ahead and go over to another card. Let's talk about Third Path Iconoclast. And this card is really good in a lot of different decks, and we'll talk about a couple decks that it can go in a little bit later. But Third Path Iconoclast is a card that has made its way into Modern. I saw Andrea Mengucci playing this in a Modern shell. It was a blue-red deck, but it utilizes Third Path Iconoclast, and it utilized the fact that it makes artifact tokens, and it played a whole bunch of artifacts underneath and stuff. So this is a card that I think could shape up a lot of things. And there's even a deck in Modern being talked about right now called like 8 Pyromancer or something like that, with 4 Third Path Iconoclasts and 4 Pyromancers, 4 young Pyromancers. So how do you see Third Path Iconoclast kind of shaking up Modern a little bit and adding another kind of access to the format?
No, I think it's good. I think it's a different angle for some of these decks who are trying to change their game plans as far as like being proactive, because another angle of being proactive, a lot of the Izzet decks that aren't like Murktide sometimes have a hard time trying to make sure that they can attack from different angles. So I also watched Mason Clark along with Jesse Robkin. They were playing on Mason Clark's stream, and he's playing, Breach, which is a really resilient deck with third Path Iconoclast. And the other deck you were mentioning with Andrea Mengucci was really good, and Aspiring Spike had a brew as well. And so it's like giving all these decks like another angle to attack from, which some other decks in Modern have a hard time dealing with. So.
Yeah,
Obviously.
What do you think, Airball, about implications of this card in other formats other than Standard?
Yeah, I don't play a whole lot of Modern, but I do love cards like this that, in like a weird roundabout way, they enable the all-in strategies that you see in like decks that focus heavily on the graveyard. Like Arclight Phoenix focuses heavily on using the graveyard to its advantage, right? And it uses a bunch of cantrips in order to do that. And then the opponent for games 2 and 3 has access to Graveyard Hate, Rest in Peace, Unlicensed First, that kind of thing. And if Arclight Phoenix didn't have a game 2 and 3 game plan against those kind of cards, it would be totally unplayable. But now that you have a proactive threat that you can stick on the board in games 2 and 3, I think increases the diversity in the format in a good way by making all-in strategies playable in game 1, because you can shift strategies post-board.
So Pioneer has already had Young Pyromancer, right? So what is the difference of having that card and Third Path Iconoclast? Are you playing both now?
I think you probably are. I think that there's... I don't know. Phoenix probably only needs 4 copies of this effect, but I think that there are other decks that might want more than that. It depends on how heavily you're invested in super cheap spells, and maybe in Pioneer the density of those super cheap spells isn't enough to make these kinds of effects worth it. But as you get older in Magic, as the formats get older, if you have Modern, you have Legacy, and almost everything just costs 1 mana, the effects that reward the number of spells that you cast become that much more important and that much more impactful. So I don't play Modern or Legacy, but I feel like those are the formats where this would make the greatest impact, having more than 4 copies of this effect.
Yeah, I can definitely see that working, and definitely a really powerful card coming out of the new set. Let's talk about a couple cards that might go in a mono black shell or an Rakdos midrange that is already at the top of the leaderboards in Pioneer. Go for the Throat and Misery Shadow. Go for the Throat is a card that is all over the place in Standard. Almost everyone switching to that card over Infernal Grasp and Cut Down. People are playing like 4 of this and then 2 Cut Down and 2 Infernal Grasp, or maybe 4. I've seen even decks playing 4 Go for the Throat and 4 Infernal Grasp and just Cut Down altogether. But I even put Go for the Throat in my Pioneer Rakdos mid-range deck over Dreadbore because I think having the instant speed interaction against decks like Greasefang is very valuable. And the only real artifact creature that you care about is the Skyship, the boat. And that's a really big problem. So maybe in that case, you do want to play a card like Heartless Act in the board for a card like that, or maybe just a Braid. I do have a Braid in my sideboard right now, but I have 4 Go for the Throats in the main deck. And it's been really, really good in the tournaments that I've played, and I really haven't missed Dreadbore at all. The only time I really would miss Dreadbore is against Mono Green Devotion, being able to kill Kiora or something, but, I mean, you can always just attack and kill things like that, but as far as Go for the Throat is concerned, we'll talk about that first before we go to Misery Shadow, and I'll go to MichaelCrits for the Rakdos Gang conversation. Are you playing this card in your Rakdos deck?
It will be in my deck. I haven't been able to play Paper Pioneer yet. If I play on Miko, this at least 1 copy will, 1 to 2 copies. I know you're high up on the card. I think for me, probably 1 to 2 copies because I like that Dreadbore can hit Planeswalkers, which can be a problem in Pioneer. But I do really like what Go for the Throat is doing, enabling. It's kind of like a modern day Doomblade. We can have what a Doomblade is in one of our jargon episodes, but. I really like Go for the Throat. It's an amazing choice for a lot of these decks as another way to deal with what people have going on.
Yeah, what do you think about this, Airball?
Yeah, well, I'm definitely going to get a playset of them because I never got my Heartless Acts back from you after Summit.
Oh my god, I saw the Heartless Acts and I was like, no, I have your Duresses too.
Mm-hmm.
Additionally, the ones I got the ones for my mono black list, and I have the ones from the Warhammer one because it's like you can play different versions of.
The Go for the Throat from that too.
Yeah, so I got 4 copies of the Warhammer one from Card Kingdom. So,
well, yeah, I forgot to give those back to you when I was leaving because I had to leave pretty early on Sunday instead of leaving Monday like I wanted to. But I do have your Heartless Acts and I do have your Duresses.
Yeah, I was going to say you were under duress.
I was under duress.
You did not give back to me. Yeah,
that's true. I saw them and I was like, wait, those are definitely Airballs.
100%, yes. And I'm never seeing them again.
You're never seeing them again. I'm selling them, actually. No, I'm not.
Wow. But to your point about Dreadbore versus Go for the Throat, I saw your poll on this on Twitter, but I didn't see the result. When I voted for Go for the Throat as the card I would more want in my Rakdos deck, it was losing at the time. What ended up happening with that poll?
Oh, it was a massive landslide loss for Go for the Throat. Just everyone loved Dreadbore. It was like 77% Dreadbore, like 23% Go for the Throat. And I feel like that's bizarre because like it's an instant and it costs 1 and a black and not red-black. Like I feel like being a sorcery is just such a huge downside in a deck where in a deck like Rakdos where you want to see what angle your opponent wants to shoot from on their turn and then punish their angle.
Well, especially because the things that Go for the Throat misses on, the artifact creatures, they're vehicles that Dreadbore doesn't hit anyway. Like, it's such a bizarre... I'm not a Rakdos player, really. I dabble, but it's bizarre to me that people like Dreadbore in a deck where the main plan for dealing with Planeswalkers is just to attack them down.
Yeah, the only Planeswalker that you can't attack down is Kiora. Like, Teferi, you can attack. Teferi Hero Dominaria, you can attack down. Narset, you can attack down. Wandering Emperor, you can attack down. Karn Great Creator, you always attack down because you always have a 3-power creature after they minus it once, which puts it on 3 loyalty. You're attacking down almost every Planeswalker that's in the meta. And with the only exception of Kiora, which is why I currently have like 1 copy of Dreadbore in my whole entire 75. Because sure, I can hit a Kiora every once in a while, but maybe I put 1 Heartless Act in like a Braid just because I can hit the Skyship. But
yeah, because you have the Heartless Acts now.
Yeah, because I own them now. I
Correct.
own them. They're mine. No, but yeah, to your point, Dreadbore can't hit the vehicles anyway unless they block with it first, and they don't want to put they already think you have Dreadbore in your deck, so they don't want to like crew to block with the ship because it could get Dreadbore, so they just never block with it. So it was super interesting that a lot of people on Twitter, and this poll got like hundreds of votes, and it was 77% against Go for the Throat.
Yeah,
I think I'll just chalk it up to them not knowing. They don't understand.
Yeah, it's the people who are wrong.
Yeah, they're wrong.
Absolutely.
I can't be wrong. All right, let's move on to Misery Shadow. This is a card that I think I'm not playing this card right now because I'm still playing Kalitas. I guess you could play both, but for Misery Shadow, I don't know if it's making its way into Modern. But I'll go to you, Michael, first. Are you seeing this in Rakdos decks popping up?
Yeah, I mean, like, same, to quote this, or to reference the same person, Eli Loveman had it in his deck for the RC, and he got to the top 8, I believe. And so I think, right, a lot of people look at the you need to take in the creature for both the things it does and not just for the one. And so yes, it does exile your opponent's creatures, but the thing that is really awesome too is it's a good mana sink. Like, if you're not, Rakdos, one powerful thing about Rakdos is it has many ways to use its mana, and so it thus smooths out what you're doing each turn. It maximizes, your turns, and being able to leverage that Misery Shadow to attack with it, and it makes your opponent's blocks very awkward. And then you can choose to pump or not pump, or it gives your main phase 2 so much more room to breathe, because your opponent doesn't know what to do. They don't know to remove the Misery Shadow, like, they don't know how to deal with Misery Shadow and block. So then it sets you up for having more smoother turns, whether that's leveraging mana and pumping Misery Shadow, or if it's using mana in your second main phase because your opponent didn't respond or tried to block your Misery Shadow. So I think you need to take the creature in as a twofold thing. And I think a lot of people are like, oh, it just exiles. I'm like, no. It's doing double duty.
Yeah, I can definitely see that. Like, if I'm getting attacked from a Misery Shadow and my opponent has like 3 mana open because they just played their land on turn 3, like, I'm never blocking. Whereas if that's like a different creature, I might block. Or if opponent has 3 mana open and I'm attacking with my 3/3 Graveyard Trespasser, I'm also not attacking. So it makes it hard to attack and also kind of makes it hard to block. So it's like, it just makes it super awkward. How do you feel about this card, Airball?
Yeah, I feel like this card is actually a lot better in like Standard than it is in Pioneer, only because of exactly what Michael's saying, that it's a good mana sink and it's an effective way to use your mana when you don't otherwise have a good way to use it. Right, Rakdos right now, there's no shortage of things to do in Pioneer for the most part. But in Standard, where you don't have a whole lot of utility lands, if you're playing mono black or something like that, then you often do just have 3, 4, 5 mana to pump into this in the late game, and all of a sudden it's just a 7/7, just doming your opponent. This card has impressed me more than most other cards, and I think I missed on it.
Additionally, something I do want to add is, and it's something that you don't quite understand either by looking at the card. I'm saying, y'all, not y'all, but the royal y'all.
Yeah, it couldn't be me.
Y'all. Could
never
be
be me.
But the other thing it does, even especially in Arena, is it conceals information, because you can activate it at any time. And if you have open mana, your opponent doesn't know whether that mana is whether there's a stop or something happening because you have a spell in hand, or you can pump Misery Shadow. In a weird way, starting from turn 2, it really puts the emphasis on your opponent knowing how to read you, knowing to read the meta. And it's just an amazing card. I think it's doing more than people realize.
Yeah, in Standard, there is the most powerful mana sink possible, I think, in mono black already, and that's the 1 mana 1/1 that can pump itself and have it evolve and give Death Touch and start drawing cards. Like I would rather put my mana into that than pump it into Misery Shadow, but now you have another thing to pump your mana into. So you're always using all of your mana every turn. So yeah, that's a really nice thing to be doing when you're playing Standard. All right, and we've talked about some cards that we think will impact other formats and impact Standard. Let's talk about some decks that have arisen from the new set. Number one, this is in no particular order, but we'll talk about Jund Sacrifice. There's a card called Teething Worm that I know we went over. It's a 1 mana 1/1 worm, and every time an artifact enters the battlefield, you put a +1/+1 counter on it. That can only happen once per turn, but every time an artifact enters the battlefield under your control, not once per turn, you gain 1 life. So it's taking advantage of enter the battlefield triggers of artifacts, and Jund Anvil Sacrifice definitely does that, putting artifacts on the battlefield every turn, utilizing blood tokens, utilizing Anvil, 1/1 construct artifact tokens. There's also a new card called Skyfisher Spider that is really good as well. And you can, this is in Jund, so you're playing Fable the Mirror Breaker in red, so you can copy Skyfisher Spider with Reflection of Kiki-Jiki and get more triggers off of it. And what it does is, I know we didn't go over this when we previewed the set in the past couple episodes, because it is an uncommon, I believe, but it's a 4-mana 3/3 Golgari spider. It has reach, and it says when it enters the battlefield, you can sacrifice a creature, and then if you do sacrifice a creature, you can target a non-land permanent and destroy it. So, non-land permanent, so it destroys a Wedding Announcements, Planeswalkers, anything, and Shieldred, and then you can copy it a bunch of times and sacrifice your Anvil construct tokens and do it again, and then do it again, and then do it again. So it's almost unlimited non-land permanent destruction. And also when it goes to the graveyard, when it dies, you can gain life equal to the amount of creatures in your graveyard and exile Skyfisher Spider. So I think with both of these cards, it really does put Jund Sacrifice on the map, and at least something to consider when you're building your decks. Maybe it's not tier 1, maybe it's not S tier, but it is a deck that you will have to look out for. What do you think, both of you, about this Jund Sacrifice deck popping up?
I don't know. I think it's a fun deck. I think maybe it just needs to be explored some more, and hopefully there's more to it. I know it's competing with Rakdos Sacrifice and Grixis Sacrifice, and if it can find a way to kind of line up its cards or have something else that the other decks can't do, it might be more powerful or equally powerful, like maybe leveraging the spider more somehow, or some other cards that the deck has, like the Teething, the Teething
Worm.
Mana, Teething Worm. Like maybe if there's ways to really make the deck more efficient to operate around those two things, additionally with your sacrifice engine and outlets, then I'm curious to see where the deck heads. So yeah.
If you have Oni Cult Anvil with like a Teething Worm and a Skyfisher Spider on the board, you are like cooking. You are destroying your opponent at that point, because you're making a new artifact every turn, triggering the Teething Worm, putting a +1/+1 counter on it, gaining a life, sacrificing with Skyfisher Spider, killing stuff your opponent controls. So there's a lot going on, and the board can get really scary really fast. What is your like bird's eye view, Airball?
Yeah, so this card reminds me a lot in context of the Ravenous Squirrel. It's like Ravenous Squirrel at home from the Jund Sacrifice deck in Historic. I don't think it has a home other than the Rakdos lists in the format right now, and so I think most of the power in the deck still comes from the Anvil core, and so I think when you're evaluating Jund, you need to evaluate how good you think the Anvil core is in the meta. And right now, there's a lot of there's a lot of white, there's a lot of temporary lockdown in sideboards that I'm seeing, and that card just absolutely hoses the Anvil-based strategies. It's also, Cat Oven it is not. It doesn't put as much pressure on these big over-the-top strategies that are starting to pop up with putting big permanents into play. And it relies kind of heavily on graveyard synergies as well. And Grixis is one of the best decks in the format and is pretty good at dealing with that. So I don't have a whole lot of faith in this deck as long as there's good, cheap removal and incidental graveyard hate everywhere. But maybe that changes.
Yeah, for sure. Actually, there's a card that we didn't mention yet. It's the Mishra's Research Desk, which is a big part of this deck as well. Being an artifact, being card advantage. Look at the top 2 cards, get a card. You can, up until the end of your next turn, you can play the card, and then you can basically unearth it for 1 and a red to do it again. So this deck might have a little bit more like raw card advantage than the deck we're going to talk about next, is Grixis Sacrifice. This is a similar shell, but it utilizes the third path iconoclast that we talked about earlier to make additional copies of 1/1 artifact tokens, and it makes them way easier, and easier meaning free. Every time you cast a non-creature spell, you get a free 1/1 off of the third path iconoclast, instead of having to like use an ability like Oni Cult Anvil, even though you will be playing Oni Cult Anvil in the deck, and Grixis is already a really good shell to play in Standard. What do we think Grixis Sacrifice is better than Jund? Yeah, you do get the Teething Worm. Yeah, you do get the Skyfisher Spider if you're playing green. But if you're playing blue, you do get that third path Iconoclast, which is a very strong card. So which way are you leaning between the two decks, Michael?
I would go with Grixis Sacrifice. It has kind of it has so much things that it's doing by turn 2. Once you're turn 2, turn 3 is the key things. You play a third party Iconoclast. You can follow it up with a various amount of things that starts happening, like
Fable the Mirror
it triggers
Breaker.
off. Yeah, I was going to say it triggers off Fable the Mirror Breaker. Turn 4, you have a Saheeli, or turn 4 you can play Oni Cult or a Mishra's Desk, and now you're having creatures, and so you're creating virtual card advantage every time you get another token from third party Iconoclasts, and you start leveraging that virtual card advantage in many different ways. This deck has great ways to use that virtual card advantage to turn into real card advantage, and those are powerful things you want to see. Saheeli is a house. It's wild. Like you tap an untap artifact you control. If you do draw a card, like you just tap one of the soldiers that you just made. Like that's wild. So I think because this deck is it just has so much synergies going on, and I think I watched a couple streamers play this. I mean, it's kind of reminding me of like modern type of card draw, or like any sort of decks that have like a wild amount of card draw. Like you almost see half your deck every game, which is like, that's a very powerful thing to do in Magic. If you're getting close to seeing half your deck every game, you're probably doing something like extremely strong.
Yeah, one thing I noticed with the Grixis Sacrifice deck is that when you have Saheeli on the board, and I was talking about this when we were previewing the set, but I thought Saheeli was going to be really good, and it impressed me when I was playing it. What do you think about this Grixis Sacrifice deck, Airball?
Yeah, I mean, specifically as to comparing it to Jund, I think the important difference is that in both cases you're putting a lot of extra power on the board. Like either you have the worm that gets really big, or you have the Iconoclast which goes really wide. And I think in general it's better to go wide than big in a format that has a lot of single target removal. So like go for the throating the worm, great. Go for the throating a token, not nearly as great. So that's a big deal. And also the cards that make the Rakdos core very sad are sorcery speed and kind of expensive. Farewells, temporary lockdowns, and having access to Spell Pierce, which I think is quite good in the meta right now, is a pretty big deal. So in a mid-rangey to control-y meta, having access to blue I think is an enormous deal. And also Saheeli, of course, is really good as well at diversifying your threat base.
Yep. I guess the upside of Grixis is, yes, having those counter spells to be really good against those temporary lockdowns and farewells, and then in Jund you have the ability to kill more non-land permanents than you do playing Grixis with being able to use that Skyfisher Spider. So it's just a matter of what you want, how the meta shapes up. But I do think personally that Grixis is a little bit better, because if you're playing Jund and you get farewelled, you just lose. Like there's something there is to it. Like you gotta hold cards in your hand to build your board back up after farewell, or you're just like be prepared to lose. But I guess you can try to use duress and get it out of their hand before they cast it. But you can't. You know what that old saying in mid-range decks? You can't seize the top of your opponent's deck. Let's move on to the next deck we're going to talk about. We have 3 more decks to go over. Azorius Soldiers. This is a deck that like everybody knew was going to be really good coming out of the new set. And cards like Siege Veteran and Harbin are cards that have put this deck over the top, I think, as a contender in Standard. Azorius Soldiers, I've lost many times playing a control deck against Azorius Soldiers and sweeping them and then building the board right back up. Siege Veteran makes 1/1 tokens for each non-token creature that dies, so you can sweep the board and they can still kill you. The Lord from the comes back from the graveyard as pumping up your entire team +1/+1 counters, and it's not just +1/+1 for the whole turn, it's +1/+1 counters. There's a lot of ways that they can come back after they're swept, and they also can take over the game when they're not swept, with a lot of flyers, a lot of draw power, and then Harbin closing the deal with 5 or more creatures attack that gives it +1/+0 and flying to the whole board. So have you played against Azorius Soldiers at all, or played with it, Michael? And if so, what's your take on this going forward in Standard?
So update, listeners, I'm playing Standard.
Hey, let's freaking go.
I'm playing Mono Black. So I
all right, let's not go. No, let's not freaking
no,
go.
but speaking into what's going on here, I played Mono Black against Azorius Soldiers, I think once or twice. I bodied them. But these are decks that I'm used to playing, like a mid-range type of thing, and Mono Black is mid-range aggro. So I think Azorius Soldiers is a powerful thing. I think it's one of those things where it's a deck that checks can you interact with us profitably? Can you deal with the creatures that we're putting out, or can you outvalue them? And if that's a no to your deck or no to your opening hand, I agree with what you're saying. Like Azorius Soldiers is going to run you over. But if you can meet that check, it's hard for them to kind of, maneuver around that, or to try and, play their deck in a certain way where they don't get got by certain things. So I think it's a powerful deck. And I think maybe if they do some tuning to figure out how efficient it can get and how good the synergies can be, I think it'd be a very dangerous deck. So it's something I'm keeping my eye on.
Yeah, I mean, Azorius Soldier still has cards like Thalia, Guardian of Thraben, and they still have Brutal Cathar. So there's a lot of cards that are still being played that are very good cards. What's your take on Azorius Soldiers, Airball?
Yeah, so I ran into it once in the TCG Showdown tournament this past weekend, and I was playing Grixis, and I think that matchup is quite good for Grixis, which I think is a problem for Soldiers in the meta, because Grixis is friggin' everywhere right now.
Mm-hmm.
In the tournament, 5 of the top 8 lists were Grixis. In my latter experience, it's Grixis is about 25% of the meta that I run into. It's insanity. Grixis is everywhere, and this deck just doesn't deal with it super well. Thalia is great at taxing removal spells, but Grixis right now in Standard just gets on the board, and Corpse Appraiser is such a beating for this deck. You talked about Soldiers being able to rebuild from having their board taken apart. A lot of that relies on the value that comes from the graveyard, and Corpse Appraiser just literally eats that for breakfast. Also, they have it's hard for them to deal with a Resolved Shieldred. It's one of the only decks actually that does have a problem right now dealing with a Resolved Shieldred.
I mean, outside of Brutal Cathar, but yeah.
Outside of Brutal Cathar, but it's not Brutal Cathar is not really a card that deck wants to bring in against you if you're playing Grixis, because all of your creatures ETB with value, and you don't have a problem killing the Cathar with single target removal later. So overall, I think the matchup is quite good, and I think that's a problem for Soldiers. However, my God, can that deck kill you out of nowhere if you're not expecting it?
Yes.
I was playing game 1 against the deck, and I did some math. I'm like at 19 or something, and I figured that in the worst case, if my opponent manages to deal with my board, I'm going to take 14. So I have enough time to land to Fairy and then wipe the board the following turn, and everything will be fine. And they cast a Lord and Harbin, and everything jumps over my flyers, over my creatures, and I'm just dead. Like from friggin' 19 with a Resolve to Fairy that had minused to make a token. Like, what am I supposed to do?
Oh, God.
So I didn't make that mistake again. And I do think that the deck can't get any better. It's one of these tribal decks that doesn't really have much room to improve as the format goes on, because all of the decisions are sort of made for you by Wizards in terms of deck construction. So it is what it is, and the meta will adapt to it, and it won't be able to adapt back. So I think this is as good as it's going to get, and it's already not good enough. Not super thrilled with the deck.
I think one thing it can do to adapt back is, like, the deck isn't playing enough Protect Negotiators or Spell Pierce that we talked about before, and it could definitely play those cards.
Yeah, the person I was playing against was running like 4 copies of the new God's Willing spell.
There's that card too, yeah.
Hexproof. Yeah, and that was a problem for me. I had to really slog through a bunch of the copies of those cards, but most lists I've seen are not running 4 copies of it.
Yeah, so I still think that it's still a deck that you should have on your mind, and if you aren't prepared for it, it can kill you from 19 out.
Yeah.
Let's go ahead and go over to the next deck. There's a couple decks you can play this package in. I'm going to call it a package. Repair and Recharge, Portal to Phyrexia, and One with the Multiverse. Repair and Recharge gets back an artifact or enchantment or planeswalker from their graveyard, and you make a token, the Power Stone token. You can bring back Portal to Phyrexia, the 9 mana card that may enter the battlefield trigger makes your opponent sacrifice 3 creatures, and every one of your upkeeps you get to put a creature from any graveyard onto your battlefield. With One with the Multiverse, it lets you cast cards off the top of your deck and play lands from the top of your deck as long as you have the mana to pay for them. But once per turn on your turn, you can pay 0 mana for whatever spell you want. So, and if you have multiple of these on the battlefield, it just gets out of hand. And there's definitely decks that have done this. I played a deck on my personal YouTube channel that is a Jeskai list. Play that list on Cool Stuff Inc.'s YouTube channel as well. There was also a deck from Ali Eldrazi that came out on his YouTube channel, and also on the CoolStuffInc.com channel that was One with the Multiverse with Portal to Phyrexia and Repair and Recharge. And there's also builds that are 2-colored that are playing the Invoke the invoke that brings it back. I forgot what the exact name of the invoke is. What was it?
Justice.
Yeah, invoke justice that brings back Portal to Phyrexia and one with the multiverse, basically cheating out these big 8 and 9 mana cards. It is very susceptible to graveyard hate with Graveyard Trespasser and things like that, but the Grixis card that you're talking about only exiles creatures that is played in that deck, so it doesn't actually deal with the Portal to Phyrexia or one with the multiverse in the graveyard. Do we think this deck is a contender? I think it's a contender. I think you kind of have to keep it in the back of your mind on your radar. So starting with Michael, what do you think of this deck that is trying to go over the top with huge spells?
I'm curious to see how it does like a week or two from now. I think it's a good deck for, we have to acknowledge like we're kind of 1 to 2 weeks into a new set, and so you can do a little bit more the fun stuff, and the fun stuff can be serious. And I kind of wait 2 weeks to kind of like sit on it, see if it really like stays around or adapts to how things are adapting to it. But I agree, like this is a great deck out of the gate. I think you're gonna have a lot of fun. If it's something that you love doing, like playing over the top spells, I think you should be playing this while the getting's good, and maybe the getting stays good. So I think I've been watching some streams and watching it being played out, and I think it's a good time. And I think at this moment it is a solid. It's a solid deck to be playing at this moment. Whether that is the case 1 to 2 weeks from now, we'll see.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of cards that put it in the graveyard as well. Like Fable the Mirrorbreaker can discard these cards to bring them back with Repair and Recharge.
Yeah.
You can bring Portal to Phyrexia or one with the multiverse back as early as turn 4 if you play Fable the Mirrorbreaker. You can also use Faithful Spending, the Mending card. Faithful Mending.
Yeah.
I do not know card names. Anyway, that's like a theme of this podcast. Anyway, you can use Faithful Mending to discard the cards and bring them back with Repair and Recharge or Invoke. Have you played against this deck, Airball? Have you played with it or with these cards? And what's your take on it?
I spent a lot of today playing with some Boros Invoke Justice decks. I did 2 main versions. I did the one you're talking about, which is focused on bringing back the artifact cards. And I also played with the one that was more from last standard with Sanctuary Warden, Wandering Emperor, AO, that kind of thing. And I think that the version that's putting giant permanents into play is a lot better against Grixis. So like if Grixis is everywhere like it is right now, it has a very hard time dealing with resolved enchantments. And it only has good ways to deal with artifacts if it's running a Braid, which many lists are not. So Grixis is a mid-rangey deck that doesn't have a great clock on you, so going way over the top is a pretty good strategy with respect to that. It is incredibly dependent on resolving 5 mana spells. So if Mono Blue comes back into standard, or if Make Disappear becomes a bigger thing, then all of a sudden, I think the big mana version goes out of style a little bit. It's also much more vulnerable to graveyard hate. If people bring in Graveyard Trespassers, if people bring in Unlicensed Hearses, it's kind of difficult for this deck to adapt to that. It's a much more all-in version. Whereas the Invoke Justice decks that focus on bringing back things like Sanctuary Warden get all the benefits of getting access to like lay down arms, with the ability to actually just cast their spells from hand perfectly reasonably, right? Like you can cast Invoke Justice to bring AO back from your graveyard, or you can just cast the damn thing from hand. And if you cast AO from hand and the opponent counters it, then you get to cast your Invoke Justice the next turn. I think that overall, I think the second version with the Sanctuary Wardens is better because it's more resilient to aggro and it's better against Esper. So against the wider meta, I think it's a little better, even though the version you're talking about is better against Grixis.
Yeah, I mean, if you're going to a big tournament and you're expecting to play against Grixis like 40% of your rounds, like it's definitely something that you should consider, whether you want to play the Portal to Phyrexia one with the multiverse build, or if you want to be better prepared against aggro decks like the one we're going to talk about. Oh, did you see that transition? That was awesome. Anyway,
that was beautiful.
It was, oh my gosh, so beautiful. I'm working on it, and it worked that time. Acknowledging it makes it worse. Anyway, mono red aggro is getting better with Monastery Swisspear. I've definitely died on turn 4 against this card. When they do Swisspear turn 1 and then turn 2, like a second Swisspear, and then they go like play with fire your face, and all of a sudden you just take in like 7 you're at like 13 in this turn 2. Run Special Players course, it's very iconic. It's played in a lot of formats. Played in Modern, Burn, it's played in Pioneer, but now it's in Standard, and it has skyrocketed the win rate of Mono Red. There's hundreds of matches that have been going on Arena and Best of 3, and Mono Red aggro right now is sitting at like a 63% win rate, which is crazy when you think about all of the life gain that's potentially in Standard right now. And there's a lot of sweepers, there's a lot of temporary lockdown type effects that are going to come down post sideboard against Mono Red, but Mono Red just kills you. Like, there's Play with Fire, Lightning Strike. There's a bunch of really powerful, really aggressive cards in Mono Red. Michael, have you played against this deck? Have you played with it? What's going on in Mono Red right now?
I have no idea actually what's going on in Mono Red. The thing about Mono Red, though, is that, like, if it exists in a format, it's very great and very healthy for the format, because, you know, it's one of those things that other decks need to make sure that they're prepared for, and Mono Red will check that. Like, are you not interacting until turn 3? All right, well, you're probably going to die turn 4 or turn 5. Like, that's on you. And, like, that makes decks become more efficient. It this is just, like, overall, like, how Magic metas work. And so, like, a Mono Red deck existing in a meta is usually going to be a pretty decent and good meta, as much as people want to complain about it. So I haven't looked at it as much, and I'm just trying to, like, scroll here. Is it a big mana type of thing, or big red? Because I see, like, I know it's aggro, but I also see, like,
I made a meme big red version on my YouTube channel, but this one is Monastery Swiftspear. It's Kumano faces Kakazan, Lightning Strike. It has freaking Play with Fire, Thundering Raiju as the top end. It's got the 3-mana werewolf that gives things haste. It's got the 2-mana 3/1 that makes things not be able to block, that has less power than it, and you can pump that up with Raiju or Kumano faces Kakazan. You also have Bloodthirsty Adversary. That's a very powerful card. You have Phoenix Chick in there as well if you wanted to play that. There's a lot of cards that really get in there for a lot of damage for sure.
Turn 1 Kumano. I'm a fan. It's so good. Like, it's just so good. If you ever play 2 Kumanos in a game and you're Mono Red and you're beating face, like, you win those games. Like, it's just so good.
It happens a lot. Like, turn 1 Kumano into turn 2 Swiftspear, put a counter on it from Kumano's second thing, and then cast another Kumano and then pump it up again. Like, you're just dead. And so I definitely agree with what you're talking about, especially with Mono Red and Azorius Soldiers being decks that you have to prepare for. It will really make the removal spells have to be like Voltage Surge and other copies of 1-mana spells, like Cut Down. Maybe people might even trim down on more Infernal Grasps and some Go for the Throats and put in some more 1-mana interaction to get rid of, like, Thalia and the 1-drops and Swiftspear and the Phoenix Chick. Right, Airball?
Possibly.
Yeah, I agree with a lot of what you're saying. I did not see any Mono Red and Best of 3 on the ladder. I didn't see any of it in the tournament this past weekend, but I believe you when you say there are stats, because you have no reason to lie to me and you wouldn't hurt me like that.
Except for when I do hurt you like
that. Well, we don't talk about that. That's not for the public to find out about.
Right.
I agree with a lot of what you guys are saying. I just want to also add that I think monocolored decks got a pretty compelling reason to play them instead of multicolor aggro decks in the current format with Mishra's Foundry.
Yes.
The Mutavault-esque land. It used to just suck to play monocolored decks because there was no good reason to play them. You could splash another color. There were no good utility lands to pay off a monocolored mana base, and also there weren't any good aggro decks in the format, really. So the pain lands paining you for 1 every time you used them was not really all that big a deal. But now you might die if you use those pain lands too often. So I think there's a couple good reasons to switch to monocolored decks.
Yeah, I actually had to take some pain lands out of the Jund Sacrifice deck that I was playing a little while ago because I just kept dying. And it was to the pain lands. I took like 2, 3, 4 damage from pain lands over the course of the game, and that is, shall I say, painful. Anyway, that's all I wanted to cover for today. We went over some cards and decks that you probably shouldn't be thinking about going into the new set in Standard and Pioneer, maybe even a little bit of Modern. That's what's working. There's a few things that aren't working, but we might talk about that next week. The last thing I want to talk about is, we have to talk about it, Mono Black in Standard. I know, Michael, you're talking about playing Mono Black, so we talked about Go for the Throat and Misery Shadow a little bit. There's another card, Phyrexian Dragon Engine, that we can talk about a little bit as well. But talk to us about some mono black, Michael.
Okay, mono black, just chef's kiss. It's honestly like everything you want to be doing in Magic, and as far as concepts and efficiency and playing up the curve and doing powerful things and having what places to use your mana and being proactive and being reactive with like some of the spells it has. It has the whole like full Magic full Magic swath available to you. If you want to become a better player and maybe like learn how to really do everything efficiently and think through your turns, I think putting some reps into mono black, although it might not be your deck, it might not be the most powerful deck, I think will pay dividends. There's just so much going on from turn one. You get to play your the sleeper card, the 1 mana, the black mana card, which is phenomenal. Turn two, you have that 3/1 that can't block, or you can play Misery Shadow. Turn three, you get if you play Gix and you get 3 or 4 cards from your opponent, by hitting your opponent, the game pretty much just ends, like, because you've incurred such a big mana advantage and you have tempo, which is like permanence on the board. And then you have, your turn 5, you have Invoke Despair, and that is, a 3-for-1 in some cases. It's just this like perfect little deck, and even though it might not be powerful and like the listeners might not be understanding it, it's just a perfect little deck of what has going on. I think it looks a little bit different from what mono black has looked like in standard, just because it feels more complete. The mono blacks that I've seen in the past, not that they were clunky, but their game plan was kind of loose or convoluted. This one feels very tight. It just feels like you have so much going on and so much ways to operate in any game. Your opening 7 dictates how you should go through the game, and your game plan, and trying to come up with something for that. Where in the past, like, I feel like mono black's like, well, I really hope my hand comes together. I have this opening 7 and I hope we get there. Where this one's like, cool, I got a good 6 or a good 7, let's roll. So that's kind of how I feel about what's going on in mono black. It's really exciting to me.
Yeah, I think one of the new cards that I've seen is Phyrexian Fleshgorger. The 7 mana, I believe it's like a 7/4 or 7/5, and it says ward pay life equal to its power. So you definitely don't want to target that thing when it has 7 power. But it being a 3 mana 3/3 menace lifelink that has ward pay 3 life is still pretty strong, and I've seen it take the place of a couple copies of Graveyard Trespasser in the main deck too. So
yeah, you mentioning that card though. So the thing that really comes up in games is whether to play your the Graveyard Trespasser or the Phyrexian Fleshgorger, and really you should think about the game of like, how is this game gonna continue forward? Do I want my opponent to have less cards in hand and that'll favor me, or do I want my opponent to have less life and that'll favor me? And usually if you answer which one of those questions, that will give you a better key into which one you should play, because it makes their shit like way more awkward.
Yeah, I think that's what mono black does. It just makes your opponent's plays awkward. We haven't even talked about Liliana of the Veil, but it seems like every time I get like a good blocker on the board against mono black, they just hit me with the Liliana. And I'm just like, well, guess I lost now. It just feels like I lost. And what do you think about mono black right now, Airball, in standard?
I think mono black is a very difficult deck to play, but I think it's also fun for the same reasons that Michael was talking about. The mono black decks that I've played in the past have been like historic, and those were very much mono black aggro decks. They didn't really have a great late game. The curve topped out at 4, and you cast Spawn of Mayhem, and either that was going to be good enough to kill them, or you were going to lose the game on the spot. This deck can go late if it has to. Like, you can cast the Fleshgorger for 7 if you have to. You can play a control game with this deck. A lot of them are even running like Duress in the main deck, which is like not a huge, like not really an aggro strategy. You could play other more aggressive creatures in the main deck, especially in game 1, if you wanted to. This deck rewards making a very early decision about whether you're going to try to get your opponent dead or whether you're going to try to survive to the late game. You need to be very good at evaluating who's the beatdown, and I think a lot of Magic players are not very good at that. Me in particular, I find this deck difficult to play, but it's pretty rewarding when you make the right decision early on and you're rewarded for it later.
Yeah, you Airball always like to know who's the beatdown, and it's always your opponent. Like you like to know that your opponent's the beatdown. You don't want to decide.
Right.
You don't want to like decide that. You want to like know that you're the control deck.
Just be
exactly.
Just be inevitable, forehead. You never have to.
I can feel the inevitability.
Oh, your last pathetic card. Yeah.
Like he has to decide who's the beatdown. Nah, I let my opponent decide that for me.
Yeah, my version of Who's the Beatdown, if I wrote that article, would have been much shorter. It's just you.
Yeah, your opponent. Like my opponent is always beatdown. That's it.
No,
That's the end of article.
Reader. It's the Royal You reader. It's like, no, you're the beatdown.
Yes, it is you.
Okay, that'll be a good end to that, and then I'll go to the ends. I'll cut back into the ends.
Sounds good.
Thank you so much to everybody for listening, and especially those who made it this far. Make sure to give us a follow to see our next episodes. Subscribe if you're watching on YouTube. Follow us on Twitter at NutsandBoltsPod, and we'll see you in the top 8.